For a show that had barely managed to stay on the air for 3 seasons on network television in the 60s, Star Trek had spent the 70s confounding expectations, becoming more and more popular, its fandom growing like a puppy who secretly tunneled into the back of the cupboard where you store the doggy treats. After a long development process, the time had come for Star Trek to make the leap to the big screen. Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Everyone loves passive income, whether it be from investments or earning interest on your savings or some cash from a YouTube video you posted 10 years ago demonstrating how to change the battery on your car key fob.
And to open it, you just want to give it a light tap.
Collecting money for old work you did years ago seems like a good little earner. Paramount had been earning passive income from Star Trek ever since it was cancelled in 1969, first selling the episodes into syndication where it quickly became a huge success, and then earned easy cash from licensing deals for the burgeoning demand for Star Trek merchandise. If you could pop a Spock on it, they would pop a Spock on it. For a while, Paramount didn't want to upset its do-nothing and rake in the cash approach to Star Trek, but by the mid-70s, the feeling at the studio was that it was time to bring Star Trek's creator back into the fold to work on a Star Trek something. Since Star Trek's cancellation, Gene Roddenberry had tried to get a number of projects off the ground, with Star Trek's weight of expectations being both a help and a hindrance. Genesis 2, Quest of Tapes, Planet Earth, etc. had all failed to sell as a series, and so when Paramount came a-knockin', back he went to his old office to begin work on a project that would go back and forth between being a movie, then a series, then a really big movie. For a few years, new Star Trek was on and off like an overconfident strobe light. It's been a few years since the end of the 5-year mission of the Starship Enterprise as shown in the original television series. Kirk has made Admiral and been working at Starfleet. McCoy has retired and Spock had returned to Vulcan to study the Kolinar, a discipline to purge all remaining emotion. I mean, if he really wanted to become a complete asshole lacking in empathy, then, we've got apps for that. In classic Star Trek tradition as far as this film is concerned, Scotty, Uhura, Sulu and Chekhov have all been staring at a wall in the intervening years. Anyway, a massive thing.
Why is any object we don't understand always called a thing?
Well, a something is destroying things along the way to its final destination, Earth. Enterprise is given the job of dealing with this something, since it's the only ship in range. Starfleet in any emergency always seems to consist of about 3 starships and half a dozen shuttles, and of course has to send in the Enterprise, fresh from a barely complete refit, which is a bit like buying a new car but skipping the pre-delivery inspection, where they may have picked up the new car you bought only has 3 wheels and no gearbox. You also barely get past McDonald's before you find out they forgot to put coolant in the radiator. Admiral Kirk regains the captain's chair, which is awkward since the Enterprise already has a captain, Will Decker. Decker was Kirk's successor as captain of the Enterprise, but is now also Kirk's predecessor, the meat in a Kirk sandwich. Kirk taking command again temporarily is a bit like selling your truck but expecting the new owner to let you borrow it when you need to move a fridge. As for Commander Decker, his ex-girlfriend Ilea is assigned to the Enterprise bridge crew as navigator, slapping down the thirsty bridge crew.
My oath of celibacy is on record, Captain.
Enterprise slowly heads out of space dock and eventually begins its mission to confront the something before it reaches Earth. Kirk finds himself in competition with the underling he had stabbed in the back, an underling who successfully embarrasses Kirk on several occasions.
Damn it, Bones. I need you.
McCoy, being an unwilling participant in this mission, passes his time by psychoanalyzing Kirk, just as one would leave a negative review on Glassdoor. En route, Spock appears.
Permission to come aboard, sir.
Granted, sir. Granted.
But he's not his usual warm, gregarious self, ignoring most of his former comrades who are actually pleased to see him.
It's how we all feel, Mr. Spock.
Captain.
Spock is like a surly pet cat who only comes up to you at mealtimes but hisses at you if you so much as look at him. Also, Fluffkins, if you're watching this, fuck you, I'm getting a beagle.
I need him.
Spock has been getting signals from the something. It's possibly a vessel or a mechanism or a creature, and he needs to understand. Decker's reunion with Ilea is cut short when she's taken away by the something. That's okay, she was probably too old for him. Then she's returned, but now as a mechanical replica, a probe from the something, now known as V'Ger. Ignoring the flat-out murder of the organic Ilea, Kirk and company try to get as much information about V'Ger from the robotic duplicate Ilea as they can.
The carbon units use this area for recreation. This is one of the games.
V'Ger arrives at Earth and wants the Creator to respond, but everyone on Earth pretends they're not home, hoping V'Ger will just go away. But as it gets no answer, it intends on sterilizing the planet. I mean, you could have made some polite small talk at the front door and pretend you had to wash your hair, but it seems as though V'Ger takes rejection poorly.
The Creator has not answered. The carbon unit infestation is to be removed from the Creator's planet.
Kirk gambles that he can give V'Ger what it wants, but only in person. They reach the center of the vessel and find that V'Ger is in fact Voyager 6. Things start to click into place, like a family of 8 all putting on their seatbelts at the same time. V'Ger, or Voyager, a primitive Earth probe sent into space hundreds of years earlier, had encountered some other machine creatures who looked at their new simpleton kin, gave it a massive upgrade to help it complete its mission, but also made it a tad overpowered, like using a flamethrower to light a gas barbecue. Star Trek the motion picture has often been derided as the motionless picture, slow-moving, clinical and dull, like a live stream of somebody hypermiling their new EV. It was expensive for its time and would have been considered a failure if thirsty Star Trek fans hadn't lapped it up and seen the film multiple times, making it a sorta hit despite its bloated budget. Of course, the studio would eventually include the cost of development of the film and the several Trek projects leading up to the film, so we'll have to go back a bit by slingshotting around the sun and all of that incumbent jazz.
Admiral, we have just finished 18 months redesigning and refitting the Enterprise. How in the name of hell do they expect me to have it ready in 12 hours?
Take me over, please.
Firstly, there was a weekly TV series, Star Trek, made by Desilu Studios, picked up by NBC for the 1966 season, which then became a Paramount property when that studio acquired Desilu during Trek's second season. Then, after being a bubble show for a while, the show was cancelled after its third season wrapped in 1969. Sold into syndication and often stripped 5 nights a week outside of primetime, Star Trek quickly became a hit, leading to fan conventions, an animated series in the early 70s, and a booming merchandise market. After all, if they could pop a Spock on it, why not pop a Spock on it? Sniffing the air, Paramount wheeled out Trek's creator Gene Roddenberry to write a reunion something. Trek's death and resurrection is of course well documented, like an influencer's holiday. Throughout the second half of the 70s, the Star Trek project was in favour and then out of favour and then in favour again.
I think I'm going to get spacesick.
Gene Roddenberry wanted to use an idea originally formulated for his proposed Genesis 2 series that never got past the pilot stage. Yet the series' premise was basically retooled first as Planet Earth and then, without Roddenberry, Strange New World. The original Genesis 2 plot, Robots Return, was about an Earth probe coming home.
I'm afraid it's much worse than was feared.
Okay, so it was also the exact same premise from John Meredith Lucas's script from Star Trek's second season, The Changeling, mixed in a bit with The Doomsday Machine, which also featured a character called Commodore Decker. Those episodes were each made for around $200,000 and featured either a killer coffee urn or a killer cornetto. While a decade or so later, the same ideas would result in the most expensive Star Trek film until the mid-1990s. Other writers were brought in to help with Roddenberry's writing, and then Paramount decided it wanted to launch its own television network with a new Star Trek series as its anchor. Star Trek Phase 2 or Star Trek 2 would document the original crew on a new 5-year mission, but one without Spock, since Leonard Nimoy had unresolved issues with Paramount. Basically, they had been popping Spocks on everything going. A new full Vulcan science officer character was created, Zon. Kirk was also a bit iffy, not because of Shatner's availability, but because there were elements within Paramount who initially weren't sure they wanted him as the series lead. Cast and crew were hired, sets and costumes and models produced, scripts and outlines were worked on for a 13-episode season, and then, like any penguin you care to ask, Paramount got cold feet and their TV network was dead. Around this time, Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind had shown there was life in a big screen science fiction film, and so Star Trek Phase 2 was cancelled before it began and its pilot script retooled to become the basis of a Star Trek feature film. Finding a name would be tricky, with Paramount racking their collective brains for a title that would be sexy enough to get people into theatres, and in the end just went with the creatively titled Star Trek the Motion Picture. Sets were upgraded, effects discarded, personnel shuffled, costumes redesigned, and the script. Well, work proceeded on draft after draft after draft of the script. Other writers had worked on various versions of the script: Alan Dean Foster, Harold Livingston, John Povell. Roddenberry rewrote their work, who rewrote his work, who then rewrote their work, who rewrote his work, and unlike Paramount, you get the picture. Kirk will be right back, no finished script, so he's just using his imagination.
And I'm witnessing some sort of dimensional image which I believe to be a representation of Vija's home planet.
The studio kept pouring money into the project and hired director Robert Wise to class up the joint. Wise had previously directed sci-fi classics such as The Day the Earth Stood Still and The Andromeda Strain, along with many non-genre films like The Sound of Music. The start date came and went without a finished script, but they began filming anyway, since the film was already booked into theatres for a December 1979 release. Paramount and Nimoy settled their beef, possibly through Greco-Roman wrestling, but more likely something to do with lots of lawyers. Spock's return meant there was no need for replacement character Zon, though as a consolation the actor cast David Gautreaux does play a small role in the finished film. Effects sequences were churned out by the visual effects companies, while Wise shot take after take of people looking at awe at something that wasn't there, namely the script. A lot of detail went into the props and sets and costumes, but only a small fraction of it was ever seen in the finished picture. The original effects producers worked for a long time with little to show for it, and with a fixed release date, they were replaced by effects pioneer Douglas Trumbull, who was brought in to right the ship. John Dykstra and his company also came in to help finish the job on time. Finishing the effects work before release date would be touch and go. Paramount threw bodies at the mountain of effects work, and when that didn't work, they instead hired living visual effects technicians to do the work. In the movie, the Enterprise has to leave space dock before it's ready to undertake a mission of this magnitude. Likewise, Star Trek the Motion Picture was a film that began filming before a final script was complete, the infrastructure to create the effects, or a budget. It's life imitating art, if life was people staring slack-jawed at screens all day. Composer Jerry Goldsmith was getting antsy. With so many of the visuals not available to view while he was writing, he had to give it his best guess, a process that would result in a lot of writing and rewriting of the music to Wise's satisfaction. Goldsmith's rousing theme tune manages to be its own thing, yet it's perfect for Star Trek. So perfect that when Star Trek would eventually return to television later in the 80s, it was a rearranged version of Goldsmith's theme for this film that was eventually used. The score is easily one of the best for any Star Trek feature, with perhaps James Horner's score for the next film being the only real challenger. Alexander Courage's original score is heard occasionally, neatly tying up the movie with the original series. It's not a particularly controversial view to say that the soundtrack is by far the best thing about this movie. The last reel of the film was a problem until a visually pleasing ending was conjured up. Vija somehow uploads all of its data by turning Decker into a hard drive, joining in some sort of weird cloud storage threesome between the former captain, somebody who looks exactly like his ex, and her boss. The light show is certainly spectacular enough, even if it makes about as much sense as a concussed skydiving instructor.
Wait until you hit the ground, then pull the ripcord.
Star Trek the Motion Picture has a very simple plot with a few subplots. The main thread of intercepting Vija is simple, while we have Spock remembering he does actually have friends, and Kirk trying to elbow out his younger replacement.
Well, Bones, do the new medical facilities meet with your approval?
They do not. It's like working in a damn computer center.
McCoy, having been forced back into service, spends his time either complaining, baiting Spock,
You're just as warm and sociable as ever.
or tut-tutting Kirk's every move, loudly in public, like a really indiscreet psychiatrist.
You're pushing.
At one point, Spock goes rogue, taking it upon himself to investigate personally and performs a mind meld with Vija, which is a bit like plugging a diagnostic car scanner into NORAD. Finally, the plot starts to come together. Vija is a child who can't experience emotions, but needs answers about the nature of existence. If you were still awake at this point, the film then starts to make some sense, unlike the evidence given by that skydiving instructor at the inquest. While most of them have been promoted, Scotty, Uhura, Sulu and Chekhov spend most of the film as afterthoughts, given the same level of dialogue as less recognisable bit part players, and after the film, according to the writers and producers of this film, they could return to their inert state staring at a wall until they're needed for another Star Trek project. There's a brief appearance by Grace Lee Whitney and a slightly larger role for Majel Barrett Roddenberry. But the bulk of the film is Decker, Ilia, McCoy, Spock, and an oddly stilted William Shatner. Such were the appalling speeds of dial-up modems in the late 1970s, his Kirk needs far more buffering than before.
Report to you, sir.
It is my intention to be on that ship following that meeting.
In this film, Kirk is a lot more stoic, less hammy, but also a little less human. Perhaps Shatner wanted to be taken more seriously as a leading man heading into the 1980s.
Yes, it is.
The rest of the cast fall back into their roles, such as they were, with relative ease. Persis Khambatta is saddled with a shaved head and having to play two versions of Ilia, one stiff and robotic, the other an actual robot.
She's Delton, Captain.
We're supposed to go all quivery over Ilia being Delton, who are famously a race of sex addicts, as conceived of by a famous sex addict. Decker and Ilia had split up a while back without a proper goodbye, and now the two exes have to work together. Awkward. We briefly meet the Enterprise's intended Vulcan science officer, Sonak, before he is conveniently killed in a really horrific transporter accident. Investigators later believed Commander Sonak to be the latest victim of the transporter killer, with Starfleet security wanting to speak to this person of interest with a history of mangling Vulcans in transporters. William Shatner and James Doohan possibly have the warmest conversation between Scotty and Kirk ever. The warmth between the two displays just how underrated these two were as actors. I mean, you'd almost believe they were somewhat remotely friendly in real life. Back when Paramount was iffy on William Shatner, it made sense to have a younger second-in-command ready to take over if, for whatever reason, Shatner did not stay attached to the project. Decker is a remnant of that situation, though it also had roots in the idea that having the captain beamed down to a planet was, like riding a jet ski blindfolded, not the smartest move.
I would never take advantage of a sexually immature species.
Will Decker was obviously a prototype for Will Riker, and Decker's backstory relationship with Ilia would be duplicated almost verbatim in the Troy Riker history in Star Trek The Next Generation, with a few tweaks, namely a better hairstyle and picking a different Greek letter. And what about this guy? We haven't said anything about this guy so far, and oh, Jesus, what a sick Robert Wise gives us a look at the Enterprise rec room, and it's one of the few times we've ever gotten a sense of just how many people were stationed on board the Enterprise. The scene was made up of professional extras, fans, and family of the cast and crew. I'm sure the lack of an invitation for me was an oversight. Otherwise, that's just cold, Bob Wise. Star Trek The Motion Picture was released 10 years after the end of the TV series, but is set around 2.5 years after the end of the first 5-year mission. So let's round up and say around 5 years after the end of the third season. William Shatner, after a decade of bouncing between guest spots, low-budget movies, and a lot of advertising work, he got into better shape than he had been through most of the original series. Everyone else looks a little older than they were in the series, with most of them saddled with similar-looking pajamas. James Doohan now sports his 80s mustache, and McCoy even had a lush beard when he's first drafted back into service. Robert Wise thought the uniforms of the original series and those designed for the now-cancelled Phase 2 series looked garish. To look garish is one thing, but to look garish in the 1970s is an amazing achievement in its own right. The eventual colour palette on the Enterprise is muted to say the least. Star Trek The Motion Picture almost looks like you're watching a movie while wearing sunglasses. Robert Wise, being a consummate professional, was a calming influence on an incredibly chaotic production that dragged on like bits of William Wallace. Principal photography took 125 days, which is a lot for a 2-hour movie with no chases, fistfights, shootouts, space battles, reincarnations, time travel or assassinations. With very few exceptions, it's people talking and staring at screens. Wise would later talk about how he'd never seen such a disorganized project. So obviously getting this film finished at all was a major achievement. The Klingons appear briefly in updated but recognisable versions of the Klingon battlecruiser, as well as an updated but not remotely recognisable version of the Klingons themselves. It's a bit like an episode of Botched, but with more gach. Mark Leonard, having already played a Romulan commander and Spock's father, returns briefly as the new-look Klingon commander, just before they get their ridged asses handed to them. Their new look is cool, putting a stamp on Klingon aesthetics that would last for the next 25 years. Though over the decades their makeover has provided us with some amazing gold medal winning mental gymnastics used by fans and writers to canonically explain the change. Dude, they have a bigger makeup budget, is apparently not the answer.
And it is a long story.
What happened? Some kind of genetic engineering? A viral mutation?
The Enterprise had a redesign inside and out. The exterior updates were fairly subtle, but different enough that even a casual viewer could tell the difference between the TV Enterprise and the one in the movie. Model work for the intended series was put aside in favour of building a really nice model of the ship. Interior sets designed and built for the series were adapted or upgraded, or sometimes scrapped in favour of something that would hold up better on the big screen. Some movie sets stayed in use in one form or another until the mid-1990s. Star Trek the Motion Picture is a dull film that I used to not like all that much, but now I don't mind it, just as I don't mind wearing shoes indoors if there's at all a chance of there being any Lego in the house. The supporting cast are barely used, but quite honestly that's still about the same as most of the original series. The roles for the supporting cast were originally much bigger, and some of the director's cut additions and deleted scenes feature a lot more of Chekhov, Sulu, Uhura and Scotty. Also missing the famous scene that I may have just made up, the photo of James Doohan sitting in his underwear in the captain's chair that he later sent to William Shatner as a joke.
Oh my God.
The effects that did make it into the film are rather nice, though like ants at a picnic, there are way too many of them. Yeah, it does feel like Star Trek, but it doesn't feel like a movie you'd show your non-Trekkie friends, assuming you had any, which, well, anyway, I'll leave that one alone. Also, it's very matte and dull. That's the lighting and colour palette. V'Ger's enormous scale means it's rarely seen in its entirety, and then when we do, it's shot after shot of pretty looking visuals that don't always move the story along, since you don't always know what you're seeing.
The possibilities of our returning from this mission in one piece may have just doubled.
Trek fans will often tell you Star Trek is not about whiz-bang action, which is unfortunate as this is the only Star Trek film that has very little whiz-bang action and is also, coincidentally, one of the least loved, particularly of the films starring the original cast. By the time Paramount had toted up all of the costs in relaunching Star Trek in some form, the final budget is often cited as being around $44 million, which made it one of the most expensive films yet made, though it did just well enough worldwide that it wasn't considered a financial disaster. We know what happens next. Paramount would go on to make much cheaper sequels while sidelining Gene Roddenberry as much as possible.
You wanted her back. You got her.
In 2001, director Robert Wise returned to oversee a director's cut of the film, one that changed a few scenes around, fixed some effects issues, and generally made the film flow a little bit better, making the motion picture, well, not suddenly amazingly dynamic, but slightly less static. In short, it made a just watchable film into a reasonably watchable one.
Oh yes, we will indeed.
As the director's cut was originally a project for the home video market at the time, it was finished as the standard definition project with some CG enhancements. It took a while, but a full remaster of the project for viewing at HD and 4K resolutions was released in 2022.
Ellen.
Yes, sir?
What was the problem down there?
He insisted we go first, sir. Said something about first seeing how it scrambled our molecules.
Star Trek the Motion Picture is an outlier, a Star Trek movie that feels like it could have been a TV episode, but one with half the dialogue stripped out. Its sequels would attempt various ways of making a different feature film each time, but tried to remember the lessons of this film, keep it fun. Next up though, Khan. But once again, if you want to live long and prosper, pop a Spock on it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below or check out some of our other videos.